She was a nurse, not a romantic. Until she met her patient's son. He came every night to sit beside his mother's hospital bed. Calm at first, then oddly intense. When their secret relationship began, she thought it was love. But the night his mother died, his calm turned cold, and his visits changed. Now he calls it destiny. She calls it danger. And soon she'll learn what loving a man who believes killing is loyalty really means. Nora worked the night shift at Greystone Hospital, where the walls hummed with machines and quiet sorrow. She moved like someone who had learned to keep her emotions under lock and key. Her days were a blur of vitals, paperwork, and grief she never claimed as her own. To her, caregiving meant control, not compassion. She didn't believe in getting attached anymore, not after the last patient she tried to save didn't make it. So she stayed busy, detached and professional, telling herself that distance was the only thing keeping her sane in a place like this. That distance began to crack the night Mrs. Vance arrived. The woman was frail but sharp, her eyes following every movement Nora made. Her file described her as terminal, though something about her condition seemed inconsistent. Nora noted it quietly, a habit from years of doubting what the system claimed. But what caught her attention wasn't the patient. It was the man who arrived each evening to visit her. Adrian Vance, her only son. His presence filled the sterile room like warmth that didn't belong there. And Nora noticed how even the other nurses avoided his gaze. Adrian was polite, always thanking the staff, always staying just within the rules. But something in his calm didn't feel right. He spoke softly to his mother, but his body was tense, like he was holding back something larger than grief. Nora tried to ignore it. She'd seen strange family dynamics before. Still, she found herself watching him through the glass as he adjusted his mother's blanket or whispered near her ear. When his eyes met hers once, she looked away fast, embarrassed, confused, and curious all at once. It was the first mistake she didn't recognize as one. Over the next week, Adrian made it a point to greet Nora when he visited. He remembered details she didn't think she had shared. Her schedule, her coffee preference, the book she carried in her bag. He had an attentive charm that felt flattering, even comforting. Nora told herself it was nothing, that she was just being polite. Yet when he smiled, she caught herself wanting to linger a little longer in conversation. That desire unsettled her. It wasn't professional, but something about Adrian's sadness drew her in like gravity she couldn't reason with. Mrs. Vance noticed too. One night when Adrian had left, the older woman told Nora that her son had suffered enough loss to make anyone strange. Her voice trembled with both love and fear. She asked Nora to keep an eye on him, saying he needed someone steady. Nora nodded, unsure how to respond. She wondered whether the mother was protecting her son or warning her about him. That question stayed in her mind every shift after that. She began to sense the weight of the Vance family's secrets long before she knew any of them were real. A storm hit the city that weekend. The hospital's power flickered and backup generators kicked in. The hallways glowed in red emergency light. Nora was making rounds when she found Adrian sitting by his mother's bed, a candle burning on the table beside him. He shouldn't have been there after hours, but the security cameras were down. He told her his mother couldn't sleep through thunder, and he didn't want her to die frightened. Something about his words softened her guard. She stayed a few minutes longer, letting the quiet and candlelight feel almost peaceful for once. That night, something shifted between them. Nora had always believed her life belonged to others' needs, to patients, to schedules, to orders from doctors. But Adrian looked at her as if she were someone to be noticed, not just another uniform in the room. She told herself it was harmless, that his grief needed kindness. Still, when their hands brushed while adjusting a pillow, neither moved away. For a split second, everything around them disappeared. The machines, the storm, the rules. It was the first moment Nora let someone see her without her professional mask. The next day she avoided him entirely. She felt foolish for letting a simple touch mean anything. But Adrian made it impossible to keep her distance. He waited near the vending machines, offered her coffee, asked about her day. His tone was never pushy, but there was persistence behind it. He carried a red thread around his wrist, something she noticed every time he reached out to hand her something. He told her it was his mother's charm, meant to keep him safe from losing love. Nora laughed politely, not realizing how literal that promise truly was. Mrs. Vance's condition worsened quickly. Her heart rate spiked without reason, and her medication doses had to be adjusted repeatedly. Nora began documenting everything carefully. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was happening. Adrian's behavior became more protective, refusing to leave even when visiting hours ended. He started bringing food for Nora, saying nurses never ate enough. The gesture was thoughtful, yet it felt like ownership. Nora's co-workers teased her lightly, but she avoided answering. The truth was, she didn't know what to call what was happening. Affection, obsession, or something darker forming quietly. A week later, Nora entered Mrs. Vance's room to find Adrian asleep beside the bed. The older woman whispered that her son was too attached to her care. Nora tried to smile it off, but Mrs. Vance's next words froze her. She said, "Adrian only felt peace when someone else took control of his pain." Nora didn't understand what that meant, but the look in the woman's eyes carried deep regret. Later, Nora caught Adrian awake, pretending to sleep. He smiled faintly, as if the conversation was one he had expected all along. It unsettled her deeply. That night, the hospital staff held a small birthday gathering for a colleague. Nora didn't join. She stayed late, finishing paperwork. When she returned to the patient floor, she noticed a small untouched birthday cake sitting near Mrs. Vance's room door, the frosting slightly smudged, candles unlit. It wasn't from staff. Adrian was inside the room again, though it was hours past visiting time. He said the cake was for his mother's recovery day. Nora thought it was strange. Mrs. Vance's chart showed no improvement. The small act felt like a performance meant for her, not for his mother. The following morning, Nora noticed medication vials slightly out of place. One of the doses Mrs. Vance was due to receive had already been drawn, though she hadn't administered it yet. Her instincts told her something wasn't right. She checked the logs, but nothing appeared unusual. Adrian arrived early that day, carrying flowers. He complimented her new hair clip, something she didn't remember wearing before work. It dawned on her that it wasn't hers. Panic flickered beneath her calm as she realized Adrian might have been near her belongings while she wasn't looking. She said nothing and kept working. Mrs. Vance's condition declined overnight. Nora stayed in the room longer than usual, running extra checks. The patient barely responded but seemed aware of her son's presence. Adrian stood still, staring at the monitor like he was waiting for permission to do something irreversible. Nora asked the doctor for a second opinion, but Adrian interrupted, insisting his mother had suffered enough. His voice was gentle but carried finality. Nora didn't know whether to report it or comfort him. She chose silence, a decision that would follow her far beyond that night. By the end of that week, Mrs. Vance passed away quietly during the night shift. Nora was the first to find her. The monitor had flatlined, yet the room didn't look disturbed. Adrian arrived minutes later, as if he already knew. He didn't cry. Instead, he touched his mother's hand and whispered about peace and endings. He then turned to Nora, thanking her for helping him set her free. The phrasing chilled her. She wanted to believe it was grief speaking, but something in his steady tone made her wonder if the death had been mercy or murder. After the funeral, Adrian continued to visit the hospital. He brought Nora small gifts: a book, flowers, a bracelet made of red thread like his own. He said she reminded him of what his mother wanted him to protect. Nora felt uneasy but didn't reject him outright. Her guilt made her vulnerable. She feared her inaction had cost a life. Adrian saw that guilt and fed on it. Each visit became more personal, more intrusive. He began calling her late at night. Every message ended the same way, with 3 words that sounded more like a warning than love. Nora told herself that Adrian's visits would fade now that his mother was gone, but they didn't. He started waiting for her outside the hospital, after every shift. Some nights he'd offer to walk her to her car. Other times he'd just stand across the street, watching until she drove off. She didn't want to believe it was wrong, but her stomach twisted every time she saw his car parked near the gate. His grief had turned into fixation, and deep down she knew it wasn't compassion keeping him near. It was control disguised as care. A week later, a hospital review began for Mrs. Vance's file. The death was classified as natural, but the board wanted to confirm medication logs. Nora's hands shook when she signed her statement. Adrian sent her a message that same night, saying the investigation didn't bother him because the right people always understand love. That line kept echoing in her head. She reread it until her chest felt tight. Love wasn't supposed to sound like that. Still, she deleted the message instead of reporting it, unsure if she was protecting him or herself from what might surface. Adrian began sending her photos, old ones of the hospital room, his mother's garden, even a picture of the candle from the night of the storm. He said they were memories worth keeping. Nora wanted to block him but couldn't bring herself to do it. Each image came with kind words that softened her anger. It felt easier to forgive than confront. She started questioning her own boundaries, wondering if she'd somehow encouraged him. The guilt built quietly, feeding the idea that maybe she owed him comfort for all the pain he'd endured. That thought was her trap. Nora's co-workers noticed her distraction. She began missing small details, misplaced files, wrong labels, skipped lunches. When asked, she blamed exhaustion. In truth, she barely slept. Every night Adrian's messages appeared at the same time, like clockwork. Sometimes he'd quote things she'd said weeks earlier, word for word. It was unsettling how closely he remembered everything. One evening he sent a photo of her apartment building from across the street. Her blood ran cold, but she still couldn't call the police. She told herself it was just coincidence, but even denial was starting to feel fragile now. She decided to take a few days off to clear her mind. When she returned, she found a small box waiting in her locker. Inside was a bottle of imported perfume, the same scent Mrs. Vance used to wear. The tag read, "For strength and remembrance." Nora's chest tightened as she smelled it. The fragrance filled her with nausea instead of comfort. She knew only one person who would have known that scent's meaning. She threw it in the trash, but the smell lingered on her hands for hours. It felt like Adrian's way of saying he still owned her. That same week, she began receiving anonymous notes written in neat cursive. They warned her to watch her back and stay quiet if she wanted peace. At first, she thought they came from hospital staff gossiping about her and Adrian. But when one note arrived at her apartment door, she realized someone had been inside her building. Her fear deepened when she noticed the handwriting looked identical to Adrian's. She started locking her doors twice, drawing curtains before bed. But nothing erased the feeling that his presence had seeped into every corner of her life. A few nights later, Nora heard a faint buzzing outside her apartment window. Looking out, she saw a small drone hovering near the glass, its light blinking softly. It hovered for a few minutes before losing balance and crashing into the balcony. When she examined it, she found a small note attached to its side that read, "You can't hide from care." The handwriting was his. Nora took the drone to work the next day, intending to show security, but fear of looking paranoid stopped her. She left it in her locker, hoping silence would make him lose interest. Adrian didn't mention the drone, but his next message said he dreamed of flying above her building, watching her sleep. The words made her stomach twist. She knew she needed to cut him off completely. That night she typed a long message telling him to stop contacting her. Before she could send it, another message arrived, a photo of her inside the hospital cafeteria taken just minutes earlier. He wrote, "You look tired. You should rest." She deleted her unsent message. The idea of confronting him now felt too dangerous. He was watching and she was alone. Her anxiety began affecting her work. She forgot patient schedules, misplaced medication sheets, and once left a storage room unlocked. The head nurse called her in for a talk, suggesting she take counseling through the hospital. Nora nodded, pretending everything was fine. She didn't tell anyone the real reason for her stress. Later that evening, she saw Adrian sitting in his car across the street again. When she looked his way, he waved like nothing was wrong. That easy smile, the same one that once felt warm, now looked like a mask he wore only for her. The next day, Adrian approached her in the hospital parking lot, holding a bouquet. He apologized for his behavior and said grief made him act strangely. Nora wanted to believe him. His words were calm, rehearsed, perfect. He even laughed, saying he'd donate to the hospital in his mother's memory. It all sounded reasonable. Against her better judgment, she nodded. That tiny gesture was enough. He took it as forgiveness, and from that moment he was back in her life. Not as a visitor this time, but as something much more invasive than she could control. Adrian began sending money to the hospital under Nora's name, claiming she'd inspired him to honor his mother's caregivers. The administration praised her, thinking she'd helped secure funding. Nora wanted to protest, but feared revealing the truth. Adrian had made her look complicit, and she didn't even realize it until it was too late. He turned generosity into a leash, tightening it with every donation. The staff saw him as a grieving son. Nora saw him for what he was, someone who understood how to manipulate guilt until it felt like love. The hospital review finally concluded that Mrs. Vance's death had been due to natural causes. Adrian invited Nora to dinner to celebrate closure. She refused politely, but the next morning she found a note on her windshield saying, "You'll come around. You always do." She tore it up, but the message stuck in her head. She started wondering if Adrian was capable of hurting her, or if he'd just keep breaking her peace instead. Each time her phone buzzed, her body tensed. Love had turned into surveillance, and she didn't know how to escape without starting a war. One evening, Nora's friend from the hospital told her she'd seen Adrian in the records department asking for access to Mrs. Vance's files. He claimed Nora had sent him. Nora panicked. She went to confront the records clerk, who confirmed Adrian had retrieved copies of dosage reports. That night, he messaged her again, saying he'd found proof his mother's death wasn't natural. She wanted to ask what he meant, but she stopped herself. Whatever proof he had, she knew he would use it to pull her closer, to twist guilt into something he could own. Nora couldn't stop thinking about the files Adrian had taken. She tried to reach out to her supervisor, but her courage failed when she imagined how the story would sound. A nurse accused of misconduct, linked to a patient's son. It was career suicide. She deleted the drafted email and sat in silence for hours. Later that night, she found another gift at her door. A crystal frame with a photo of her and Mrs. Vance during rounds. One she never remembered being taken. On the back, a note read, "Two angels who saved me." She almost screamed. Her fear turned into restlessness. Nora decided to confront Adrian in person to put an end to it. But when she reached his apartment, the door was unlocked. Inside, she found walls covered in photos. Her at work, walking home, sitting in cafes, even standing by her window. Each picture had dates and short notes written beside them. On his desk there was a hospital chart. Mrs. Vance's file with her name circled in red. It wasn't love anymore. It was research, obsession, and control carefully built to look like devotion. She ran before he returned. Before we continue and see how it ends, take a second to like the video and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps bring more stories like this one. Nora stopped going to work for a few days. She told the hospital she was sick, but the truth was she couldn't bear to see the same halls that now felt like traps. Her phone filled with unread messages from Adrian. Apologies, promises, threats, all mixed together. One said, "We need to finish what started." Another said, "You belong where she left you." She didn't know which was worse, his longing or his logic. Both sounded like a person who had replaced grief with possession and wanted her to play the part his mother once did. A few days later, Nora came home to find her door unlocked. Nothing was stolen, but her living room smelled faintly of the same imported perfume. On the table lay a single flower from the bouquet he once gave her. She sat on the floor shaking, realizing he could enter her life whenever he wanted. She changed the locks the next morning, but it didn't matter anymore. He didn't need to break in to control her. He was inside her mind now, shaping every thought she tried to ignore. She couldn't tell if fear or guilt owned her more. Desperate for clarity, Nora visited Mrs. Vance's grave. The cemetery was quiet, only a soft drizzle falling over the grass. She placed white flowers on the headstone and whispered a promise to stop living in fear. But as she turned to leave, she noticed a red thread tied neatly around one of the flowers she hadn't brought. The knot was small and deliberate. She looked around. No one was there. The realization sank in. Adrian had been here first. He wanted her to know she was still part of the ritual his mother had started. When Nora returned home that night, she found Adrian waiting by her apartment door. His expression was calm, almost relieved. He said he needed to explain. Against her better judgment, she let him in, too drained to resist. He told her he'd discovered that his mother's doctor had altered doses for months and that he had evidence of it. Nora listened quietly, unsure what to believe. Then he looked at her and said she wasn't innocent either, because she'd let it happen. His voice wasn't angry, just certain. It sounded less like accusation and more like recruitment. He began visiting daily again, claiming he needed her help gathering proof. Nora felt trapped. Every time she tried to push him away, he reminded her she'd been there the night his mother died. He used her silence as leverage, calling it partnership. Nora didn't know how much of what he said was true, but she felt herself unraveling. She wanted to confess everything to the hospital board, but fear of losing her job and reputation paralyzed her. Adrian had found her weakness, her need to appear in control even when she was falling apart. The strain became unbearable. Nora started hearing things, small sounds in her apartment, faint knocking, distant bells outside her window. She convinced herself it was stress until she saw the red thread tied to her doorknob one morning. It wasn't her imagination. Adrian was keeping her under constant watch. She untied the thread and threw it away, but when she returned that evening, a new one was there, tied tighter. She realized this wasn't about love anymore. It was a game about ownership, one she hadn't even known she was playing until she'd already lost. Her breaking point came when a coworker mentioned seeing Adrian in the hospital again. He'd donated new equipment in her name. The thought made her dizzy. She confronted him later that evening, asking what he wanted. His answer chilled her. He said he wanted her to understand the peace his mother felt. That night, Nora dreamed of the hospital room again. The candlelight, the storm, the hum of machines. She woke up in sweat, realizing the dream wasn't memory but replay. Adrian wasn't moving on. He was recreating everything that began with that single touch. Determined to end it, Nora went to the police with the drone, notes, and photos. They listened but said there wasn't enough proof of danger, only fixation. She felt humiliated, leaving the station. Adrian was too smart. Too careful. He'd never made threats, only gestures that looked like devotion. That night, she found an envelope under her door containing a photo of her at the police station. On the back it said, "You can't betray love." She realized he wanted her trapped, not by violence, but by fear of being disbelieved. And it was working perfectly. Nora's mental state began to crumble. She took sleeping pills just to rest. Avoiding mirrors, avoiding windows. She unplugged her phone, but the silence only made things louder inside her head. At work she barely spoke. Her supervisor suggested leave again. She knew she'd lose her job if she disappeared longer, but she also knew staying would make her collapse. The conflict gnawed at her constantly, to run or to endure. She didn't yet understand that either choice would still lead her toward the same man, the same story, and the same unfinished obsession waiting to resume. One rainy night, Nora packed a small bag, planning to leave the city before dawn. When she stepped outside, Adrian was already there, standing under a streetlight, holding an umbrella. His voice was calm, almost gentle. He said he'd been waiting because he knew she'd try to leave without saying goodbye. In his other hand, he held Mrs. Vance's locket, the one Nora had placed on the patient's neck after death. She hadn't told anyone about it. That was the moment she realized there was no escape left. Adrian knew her life down to its smallest secret. Nora froze, staring at the locket in Adrian's hand. She didn't ask how he got it. She already knew. He talked softly, almost like a parent scolding a frightened child. He said she shouldn't run, because they were meant to finish what his mother started. Nora stayed still, calculating how to escape without provoking him. He smiled, said he forgave her for being scared, and walked her back inside like it was the most normal thing in the world. She locked the door behind him, but it no longer felt like protection. It felt like permission. The next morning, Adrian showed up at her workplace with pastries and coffee. Her coworkers laughed, teasing about her persistent admirer. Nora forced a smile while her insides churned. Every word from him carried weight. Every glance a quiet threat wrapped in affection. She thought about calling the police again, but she'd already learned how easily charm erased evidence. Adrian whispered that he'd moved some of his belongings into her apartment because it was safer. When she went home that evening, she found his coat on her chair and his toothbrush next to hers in the bathroom. Days turned into a blur. Adrian started managing her routines, making her coffee, reminding her of shifts, paying her bills without asking. At first it seemed helpful, but then he began making decisions she hadn't agreed to. He called her workplace pretending to be her emergency contact. He forwarded her calls to his number. Nora felt herself disappearing piece by piece. Each act looked caring from the outside, but she could feel her independence being erased. The more he helped, the smaller she became, until even her own life started feeling like it belonged to him. One evening she returned home to find Adrian sitting on the floor surrounded by photo albums. He said he wanted to show her his mother's letters. At first they seemed innocent, notes filled with gratitude and affection. But as she read further, the tone shifted. Mrs. Vance had written about control, guilt, and keeping love by binding pain. Nora's throat tightened. These weren't letters of love. They were instructions for ownership. Adrian said his mother believed real loyalty required sacrifice. The words sounded practiced, inherited. Nora realized this wasn't a new obsession. It was a family ritual continuing through him. The next morning, Adrian told her he wanted to start fresh, away from the city, away from judgment. He suggested they move into his mother's old estate outside town. Nora said no, but he didn't argue. Instead, he left quietly, which scared her even more. Silence meant planning. That night, she woke to find a message on her phone. "Pack your things, we're leaving soon." She didn't respond. By dawn, her apartment door was unlocked, her suitcase half-filled, her clothes folded neatly. Someone had already begun the packing for her. Adrian's idea of partnership had already started. Nora went to her supervisor, begging for transfer or extended leave. The hospital agreed to 2 weeks off. She spent the first day packing essentials, ready to move somewhere far. But that night, Adrian arrived unannounced with dinner and said he'd already prepared the move. Same city, different apartment. He'd signed a lease in both their names. When she refused to go, he laughed, telling her not to worry about paperwork. Love makes things official. His casual tone broke her. Nora realized she wasn't dealing with affection anymore, but with possession he thought he had earned. Her fear finally turned into anger. She told Adrian to get out. He didn't raise his voice or threaten her. He just looked disappointed, like she'd failed some moral test. He said she was confusing freedom with loneliness, then left quietly. Nora collapsed onto the couch, thinking it was over. But when she woke up the next morning, her phone wallpaper had changed. It was now a photo of the two of them she'd never taken. Her laptop background matched it. Every part of her digital life was slowly becoming his reflection. Control wasn't physical anymore. It was complete. Days passed without seeing him, but small reminders kept appearing. A coffee mug by the sink. An opened window she hadn't touched. A faint trace of his cologne. Nora started doubting her senses. She checked the locks every night, but found them slightly loose every morning. One evening, she came home to a red thread tied around her door handle. That single detail made her knees weaken. It wasn't just a reminder, it was a promise. Adrian was still watching, still deciding when to step back into her life completely, and she could do nothing to stop it. Unable to bear it, Nora went through the old hospital records she'd saved. Buried inside was a copy of Mrs. Vance's chart, something she'd requested for review weeks before the death. There were discrepancies, doses signed under different initials, times that didn't match her own notes. It looked altered. Panic mixed with confusion. Adrian might be telling the truth about tampering, but that meant he knew she'd kept these records. He'd planned this long before his mother's death. Nora realized he hadn't fallen in love with her. He'd selected her as part of his mother's final design. That night, Nora received a message saying, "I forgive you. Meet me at home." The address was his mother's estate, the mansion outside town. She almost deleted it, but hesitated. Maybe if she went, she could end it by recording evidence. She told no one where she was going. The drive felt endless. The house stood silent, lights faintly glowing through dusty windows. The gate was open as if waiting. She stepped inside, heart steady but mind racing. Inside, everything looked preserved. No dust, no decay, just time, frozen like the house refused to accept death ever happened. Adrian greeted her in the main hall, calm and composed. He said the house had been waiting for her. On the walls hung portraits of his mother at different ages, her gaze following every corner. The silence pressed heavy, broken only by faint ticking from an old clock. He offered her tea like they were old friends, not captor and captive. Nora sat carefully watching his movements. He talked about rebuilding the past, about how love was the only thing that could purify guilt. She realized he was no longer pretending sanity, he was performing devotion. And she was the audience. Nora noticed the photo albums stacked neatly on the table, every page showing moments she didn't remember living. There were pictures of her sitting in this same house, her hand resting near Adrian's, smiling. They were edited, seamless. He'd built a timeline where she had always belonged here. It wasn't love. It was fabrication meant to erase her real history. Adrian spoke about starting again, calling it their continuation. Nora stayed silent, afraid of provoking him. Every word he said was calm, but each one tightened the invisible thread that tied her to this house, to him, to guilt. As the evening deepened, Adrian asked her to follow him to the study. Inside were files laid across the desk, patient charts, legal documents, and medical reports. He said he'd been investigating his mother's doctor and found proof of falsified entries. But Nora noticed something wrong. Every file bore her initials. He had rewritten history, painting her as the one who adjusted the final doses. She confronted him quietly, and he smiled, saying, "We share this truth now." Her heart pounded, not out of love but recognition. He wanted them united through guilt, bound by irreversible sin. Nora tried to reason with him, asking why he'd forged her name. He said it didn't matter who did it, only who understood it. His logic twisted love into absolution. He claimed that his mother had suffered needlessly and that freeing her was an act of loyalty, not cruelty. Then he said Nora had done the same, that her silence made her part of it. He was right, in a way. She had stayed quiet, and that silence had killed more than one life. But now her silence wasn't mercy. It was the rope he was tightening around her. Adrian showed her a new set of papers, an insurance claim with both their names, He said his mother's estate would now transfer to them together. Nora's breath caught as she realized he'd already signed for her. She tried to protest, but he raised a hand calmly, saying it was already done. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction, like he'd just finished the last step of a plan. He wasn't seeking love or forgiveness. He was cementing ownership, legally, emotionally, psychologically. Nora wasn't his partner. She was his witness, tied to his crime by forged proof and real fear. As night grew deeper, the house lost power. Adrian cursed under his breath, then smiled, saying the storm must be testing them. Nora used the moment to slip away into the hallway. Her flashlight cast trembling shadows across the portraits. Each picture looked alive, eyes reflecting faint light. She found the basement door slightly open. Inside, boxes were stacked neatly, labeled with dates and initials. She scanned one. It was filled with patient belongings, all from the same hospital. Some were tagged transferred, others expired. It wasn't memorabilia. It was record-keeping for something far more deliberate. She realized Adrian had been collecting reminders of his mother's influence for years. Every patient she'd befriended, every case she'd interfered with, he'd documented. His obsession wasn't spontaneous. It was continuation. Nora heard footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate. Adrian called her name softly, his tone affectionate. She turned off the flashlight, crouching behind the boxes. A faint bell rang outside, echoing through the storm. The same sound she'd been hearing for weeks. It wasn't her imagination. It was the estate's old bell tower ringing in rhythm with Adrian's voice, like the house itself had learned to obey him. Her hiding spot felt temporary. She knew she couldn't stay long. She searched the boxes again and found a small drawer containing Mrs. Vance's handwriting. One letter read, "To bind love, you must create guilt strong enough to endure eternity." The words chilled her. Adrian wasn't acting alone. He was living out his mother's ideology, the belief that pain preserved devotion. Nora pocketed the letter. As she turned, she saw a small camera fixed to the wall, blinking red. He was watching even now. She covered it with a cloth and backed toward the exit before the feed revealed her. Nora ran through the narrow corridor leading to a side door. It was locked from the outside. Rain poured through broken windows, drenching the floor. Her shoes slipped as she reached for the key rack, but found it empty. Behind her, Adrian's footsteps grew louder. He called out that she was safe, that the house wasn't a prison but a sanctuary. She scanned the room desperately and saw a small emergency ladder near the kitchen. She climbed toward the attic space, squeezing through dust and wooden beams, hoping to find a phone signal or a window that opened to freedom. The attic was cold and sparse, filled with trunks and covered furniture. Lightning flashed through small glass panels, revealing a single framed picture hanging crookedly on the wall, a photo of Adrian as a child standing beside his mother. In the corner stood another trunk labeled Elena Ward, nurse. The name wasn't hers, but the handwriting looked identical to Mrs. Vance's. She opened it carefully and found nurse uniforms, patient tags, and a diary. Every page chronicled years of manipulation, a cycle of choosing caretakers, binding them through guilt, and erasing them when they tried to leave. Adrian's voice echoed from below, steady and affectionate. He said he wasn't angry, just disappointed she didn't trust him. Nora held her breath, flipping through the diary. It described how his mother had once seduced and then destroyed a nurse before transferring hospitals. It was a pattern passed down, one he'd learned perfectly. Adrian didn't invent this. He inherited it. Nora understood now. She wasn't his first, just his latest chapter in a tradition built on obsession. She put the diary in her pocket, determined to escape not just him but the entire legacy written in those pages. She crawled toward a broken window at the far end of the attic. The rain hit hard, wind slicing through her skin. She pushed the glass open enough to squeeze through, but before she could climb down, Adrian appeared in the doorway below, holding a flashlight. His calm voice filled the space again, calling her name like a lover, not a predator. He said they were bound now, that guilt made them eternal. She didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed a wooden beam and swung it toward the staircase, sending debris falling in his path. She ran toward the opposite end. Her escape route led to a narrow ladder descending toward a storage hallway. She climbed down, breathing heavily. The walls here were lined with old portraits and more medical charts. Some were burned at the edges. It was a gallery of victims, disguised as legacy. As she reached the bottom, she heard the sound of footsteps again, measured, patient. Adrian wasn't chasing. He was following. He knew she'd tire out before finding a real exit. She moved quietly, heart steady, every step deliberate. She couldn't let fear control her now. Logic had to replace panic if she wanted to survive. At the end of the hall stood a heavy door marked Records. Inside were hundreds of files sorted neatly in drawers. Nora searched frantically until she found a folder labeled with her name. Inside were photos, reports, and a signed confession she never wrote. He'd already built her ending. Her mind raced for a way out. Then she saw a small service tunnel on the blueprint pinned to the wall, an emergency passage that led outside. She tore the paper down and followed the map, clutching the diary like proof that the truth hadn't been erased yet. As thunder roared outside, Nora found the tunnel entrance hidden behind a metal shelf. She pulled it open and crawled inside, knees scraping against concrete. The air was damp and cold, but she could see faint moonlight at the far end. She moved faster, clutching the diary and letter. Behind her, Adrian's voice echoed faintly, no longer calm, almost pleading. He begged her not to make him repeat history. The words froze her for a second, then pushed her forward harder. For the first time, she wasn't escaping out of fear. She was running toward evidence and freedom. The tunnel opened into a small stone cellar beneath the house. The air was cold, the walls slick with moisture. Nora could hear rain pounding against the ground above her. She climbed a narrow staircase leading to a wooden hatch. It opened into the estate's garden, overgrown and wild. The wind whipped through her clothes as she ran toward the main gate. But when she reached it, the metal latch wouldn't move. Adrian had locked it from outside. She scanned the yard for another way out and noticed headlights glowing faintly through the trees. Someone else was on the property. For a brief moment, hope surged through her. She ran toward the lights, waving her arms for help. As she drew closer, she saw it wasn't a car parked randomly. It was Adrian's. The engine was still running, music playing softly inside. The passenger door stood open, raindrops dripping from the roof. On the seat lay the diary she thought she still had in her pocket. Panic hit her, as she realized he'd taken it while she was crawling through the tunnel. He'd let her find the tunnel on purpose. Every escape had been part of his design. She turned to run back toward the house, but Adrian appeared near the porch, holding an umbrella. His expression wasn't angry. It was calm, almost tender. He told her to come inside before she caught a cold. Nora stayed still, gripping the fence. Her mind raced for options. The gate was locked. The car blocked her path, and the rain made every surface slick. He walked closer, talking about forgiveness and destiny. She realized then that he didn't want to kill her. He wanted to make her stay willingly, to believe she belonged inside the trap he'd built. Nora backed away slowly, her shoes slipping in the mud. Adrian reached for her wrist, and in that instant something inside her snapped. She swung the metal latch from the gate, striking his hand hard enough to make him drop the umbrella. He staggered back, more shocked than hurt. Nora didn't wait. She bolted toward the garden shed behind the greenhouse. Inside she found broken tools, old gasoline cans, and a rusted fire alarm panel. Her mind jumped. The alarm system could draw attention if she triggered it. She started tearing at the wires, hoping the storm wouldn't short it. Sparks flew as she connected the broken wires. For a moment nothing happened. Then the alarm blared through the night, shrill and echoing across the empty fields. Adrian shouted her name from outside, the calm in his voice finally gone. The lights flickered across the property as the system tried to reboot itself. Nora hid behind the shed, clutching a shovel. The sound gave her seconds, maybe enough for someone nearby to hear, but the estate was far from town. The only person close enough to respond was the one she was running from. The alarm abruptly cut off, plunging the property into silence. Rain masked every sound, and Nora couldn't tell where Adrian had gone. She waited in the dark until she saw movement near the house. He was dragging something heavy, one of the gas cans. The smell carried through the air, sharp and unmistakable. He wasn't chasing her anymore. He was preparing to end it all. Nora realized he wanted a final act that bound them forever. If he couldn't make her stay by guilt, he'd use fire. She ran back toward the tunnel entrance, desperate to stop him. Inside the tunnel, the air was heavy with gasoline fumes. Nora coughed as she crawled forward, clutching the diary she'd grabbed from the car before running. The faint glow of a lighter flickered at the far end. Adrian stood in the cellar, talking softly to himself. He said love had to cleanse what guilt had created. He poured the fuel around the wooden beams, smiling faintly. Nora shouted for him to stop, her voice shaking. He turned, surprised she'd returned. He said he knew she would, because loyalty always brings people home. His certainty terrified her more than the fire. Nora grabbed a metal rod from the floor and swung at the lighter, knocking it away before it could spark. The can spilled across the ground, and Adrian lunged forward, grabbing her arm. They struggled in the dark, slipping on wet concrete. He didn't hit her. He just held her, whispering that everything could still be peaceful if she stopped fighting. She pushed him off, yelling that peace built on fear wasn't love. The lighter skidded across the floor again, landing near a wooden crate. One flicker of static from the failing lights was all it would take to ignite. Nora dived for the lighter, but Adrian reached it first. His expression softened, almost pitying. He said she'd misunderstood everything, that he didn't want her to die, only to be free of guilt. Then he dropped the lighter. Flames erupted, racing across the gasoline. The heat rose instantly, blinding and unbearable. Nora scrambled toward the exit, coughing from the smoke. Adrian didn't follow. Through the thick haze she saw him kneel, staring at the fire as if it were something holy. His mother's ideology had consumed him completely. Nora escaped the cellar just as the roof began to crack. Outside, the rain poured harder, steam rising from the burning cellar vents. Nora fell to the ground, gasping for air. The house's lower windows glowed orange, flickering violently. She shouted for help, but the storm drowned her voice. Sirens began wailing in the distance. Someone must have heard the alarm after all. She staggered toward the road, clutching her burned arm. When she looked back, the house was collapsing into flames. For the first time in months, she felt real silence in her mind. The thread had snapped. The bond Adrian built was burning with the walls. Emergency vehicles arrived minutes later. Firefighters rushed toward the estate, shouting orders through the wind. Nora tried to explain, but her voice was hoarse. One officer guided her into an ambulance. As medics cleaned her burns, she watched the house crumble completely. There was no sign of Adrian among the rescuers. Part of her wanted to believe he was dead, that the fire ended his legacy. But another part knew people like him didn't die easily. They lingered in memories, guilt, and nightmares. She closed her eyes, hearing that faint bell sound in her head again, refusing to fade. At the hospital, Nora was treated for smoke inhalation and minor burns. Reporters gathered outside, calling the fire a tragic accident. When police questioned her, she told them only part of the truth, that a man had trapped her and set the house ablaze. They asked for his name. She hesitated before saying it. When they searched the records, no one named Adrian Vance officially existed. The estate, The donations, even the hospital records tied to him were all under aliases. Nora realized he had erased his own existence long before that night, leaving only ghosts behind. The authorities recovered several files from the burned house. Among them was the diary Nora had risked her life to save. It became the key piece of evidence, revealing the pattern of manipulation and patient deaths tied to the Vance family. The investigators called it a cycle of psychological conditioning. Nora called it inheritance. They asked her to testify about her involvement. She agreed but told them one truth. She couldn't erase. That silence had made her part of it. Every act of mercy she justified had been another stitch in a pattern she never saw forming. Weeks passed, and Nora was placed under temporary protection while the investigation continued. She lived in a small hotel room near the coast, avoiding mirrors and news reports. One morning, a letter arrived with no return address. Inside was a small red thread, and a note that said, "You survived because I let you." Her stomach turned. The handwriting was unmistakable. Adrian was alive. The police traced the letter, but no fingerprints were found. They increased her protection, but Nora knew protection didn't stop people who lived inside your mind. Fear had become routine. Quiet, constant, almost normal. Every night, Nora dreamed of the house burning. In the dreams, Adrian stood inside the flames, calm and smiling, as if the fire were cleansing him instead of killing him. She'd wake drenched in sweat, reaching for her phone, half expecting a message waiting for her. Sometimes there was blank texts sent from unknown numbers, always at the same time. Investigators said they came from burner phones. She deleted them, but the relief never lasted. He was reminding her that survival wasn't escape. It was proof that she still carried his story wherever she went. Months later, the hospital offered Nora her job back. She declined. Instead, she began working in a community clinic, trying to rebuild a simpler life. The people there didn't know her past, and she didn't correct their assumptions. For a while, she felt almost human again. Until one evening, while closing the clinic, she heard that faint bell sound outside. She stepped into the parking lot, scanning the streetlights. There was nothing there but rain. Still, she couldn't shake the thought that he was near. Not to harm her, but to remind her that their connection still existed. One night, Nora found a small jar of imported honey on her doorstep, the same brand Adrian had once gifted her. A card beside it read, "For healing." She hesitated before touching it. The jar was sealed, untouched, but she felt sick looking at it. The handwriting on the card matched his. She took it to the police, who said it might be a prank. But she knew better. Adrian wasn't gone. He was sending reminders of ownership disguised as care. She threw the jar away, but later that night, she could still smell the honey on her hands. The next morning, Nora decided to stop living in reaction to him. She joined a trauma support group for caregivers, speaking for the first time about manipulation and guilt. Hearing others share similar experiences made her feel less alone. Yet when it was her turn, she couldn't say his name. She said only that she once mistook control for love and silence for peace. The group listened quietly. For the first time in years, she didn't feel judged. She realized healing wouldn't come from forgetting him, but from reclaiming the parts of herself that he had rewritten. During one session, a woman mentioned losing a patient under suspicious circumstances. The details mirrored Mrs. Vance's case. Altered records, falsified doses, and a donor who vanished afterward. Nora's pulse quickened. When she asked the woman where it happened, the answer hit her like a wave: a clinic 2 states away. Adrian had moved on to another place, another version of his ritual. The police were notified, but by the time they reached the clinic, he was gone. He always disappeared before exposure. His pattern continued. A ghost wearing different names, spreading loyalty through destruction. Nora felt powerless again, but this time she refused to run. She began documenting everything: messages, gifts, reports, and testimonies. She shared her story with investigators, insisting that his pattern wasn't just obsession, It was indoctrination passed from parent to child. Her evidence helped reopen several closed cases. Still, no trace of him appeared. Sometimes she wondered if she'd invented him, if the trauma had built its own ghost. Then another anonymous donation arrived at the hospital she once worked for, labeled "In memory of Mrs. Vance." The cycle wasn't over. It was expanding. One night, while driving home, Nora's headlights caught a figure walking along the roadside in the rain. The man's stride was familiar. Steady, deliberate, confident. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. When she slowed down to look closer, the road was empty. Only a red thread lay on the wet asphalt, glistening under the rain. She picked it up without thinking, then threw it away. But the image stayed with her. The thread, the rain, the road. She realized Adrian no longer needed to appear in person. The world around her had learned to echo his presence. Time passed and Nora tried to rebuild herself again. She moved to a small town where no one knew her name. She painted her walls white, kept no mirrors, no perfume, no red. She found small peace in routine, making tea, reading, tending to plants. Yet some nights, she'd glance at her window and imagine a figure standing outside. It wasn't fear anymore, just memory repeating itself. The damage Adrian caused wasn't just physical or emotional, it was structural. He had changed the way she perceived safety. She didn't know if she'd ever truly unlearn that. One afternoon, Nora received a call from the police. They'd found remains near the burned estate, bone fragments matching Adrian's age and DNA. The officer congratulated her on closure. She thanked him but didn't celebrate. She didn't trust closure that came too easily. That night, she opened her window and listened for the bell sound. It didn't come, only rain. Still, part of her couldn't believe it was over. People like Adrian didn't vanish through death. They dissolved into memory, surviving through those who remembered them. And she, unwillingly, was still keeping him alive by remembering. Nora attended one last support session. This time as a guest speaker, she spoke about boundaries, compassion, and the cost of silence. She told the group that not all evil arrives violently. Sometimes it arrives politely, offering comfort and calling it love. Her story made others cry, but she didn't. She had learned to speak about pain without reliving it. As she finished, someone in the back of the room quietly tied a red thread around their wrist. She froze, unsure whether it was coincidence or signal. The sight pulled her back into the question she could never escape. That night, Nora walked along the shoreline near her new home. The sky was gray, the waves calm. She took a small red thread from her pocket, the one she found on the road months ago, and tied it around a seashell. Then she threw it into the water. Watching it disappear, she whispered that guilt no longer owned her. Whether Adrian was dead or alive no longer mattered. What mattered was that she no longer belonged to the story he created. For the first time in years, the silence that followed didn't feel dangerous. It felt earned. Weeks after throwing the thread into the sea, Nora began volunteering at a hospice. It felt strange being around the dying again, but she wanted to rewrite her relationship with care. She helped patients write letters, held hands during sleepless nights, and listened without judgment. The work steadied her, grounding her in small acts of kindness that didn't demand guilt. Yet even in peace she remained hyper-aware of patterns. Men who smiled too long, words that sounded too familiar. Trauma had made her observant, and every kindness now carried a quiet test she no longer ignored. One evening, while sorting patient belongings, she found an unmarked envelope tucked inside a drawer. It contained a photograph of the Greystone Hospital from years ago and a note written in neat cursive. "Cycles don't end. They pass on." The handwriting wasn't Adrian's but eerily similar. Nora's heart pounded as she asked the staff who handled the room before her. They said the patient had no visitors, no family. She burned the letter in the courtyard that night. Watching it turn to ash, she reminded herself that obsession wasn't a person anymore. It was a pattern she refused to repeat. Despite her efforts to move forward, Her name resurfaced in media reports when the investigation into the Vance estate reopened. The discovery of more altered hospital records linked multiple deaths across states. Journalists wanted interviews. She declined all of them. Still, the attention made her nervous. One day she received an email from an anonymous source titled "Closure." Attached was a scanned page from Adrian's diary, one she hadn't seen before. The words read, "Death isn't the end of love. It's its proof." Nora deleted it instantly, but the phrase stuck in her mind like a whisper she couldn't unhear. A month later, Nora moved inland to escape the coastal storms. Her new apartment overlooked a quiet park where elderly couples walked their dogs. For the first time, she felt her life belonged to her again. She started painting in the evenings, simple watercolors of trees and sky. But one morning she noticed a single red thread tangled around the handle of her balcony door. She froze, staring at it. She couldn't prove how it got there, but its presence said enough. She cut it with scissors and flushed it away, refusing to let the fear rebuild itself. The police contacted her soon after. They had reopened Mrs. Vance's original case, citing inconsistencies in the coroner's report. The tests confirmed what Nora had always suspected. The cause of death wasn't heart failure. It was an overdose, precisely measured. The officer told her the substance matched samples once found in her locker. Nora felt the world tilt. Adrian had planted it long ago. She was cleared within hours, but the emotional damage returned like a storm. Every safety she had built suddenly felt breakable again. Even justice, she realized, could arrive too late to matter. After the questioning, Nora returned home exhausted. She sat by the window, rain tracing patterns down the glass. For a brief moment she felt something calm, the simplicity of breathing without waiting for danger. Then, from across the park, she saw a man standing under a streetlight. The rain blurred his features, but his posture was unmistakable. He wasn't moving, just watching. Nora blinked and he was gone. Her chest tightened. Whether it was real or imagined didn't matter. Adrian had become more than a man. He was the shape of her vigilance, the ghost of her survival. The next day, a package arrived with no return label. Inside was a small music box. When she wound it, it played a familiar tune, the lullaby Mrs. Vance used to hum during night shifts. Inside the lid, carved words read, "You were always meant to remember." Nora smashed it against the floor, breaking the tune mid-song. The metal pieces scattered like tiny echoes of everything she'd endured. She cleaned up the shards carefully, but one fragment cut her finger. Watching a single drop of blood fall onto the floor, she realized pain no longer meant fear. It meant life. That night, Nora packed her things, planning to leave once more, but as she zipped her bag, she stopped. Running hadn't saved her before. It had only extended his reach. She unpacked slowly, choosing to stay. She decided she wouldn't be defined by escape but by endurance. She placed the broken music box pieces in a jar on her shelf, not as reminders of fear but of what she'd survived. Every fragment was proof of something unbreakable inside her. For the first time she didn't feel hunted. She felt steady, ready to face whatever came next. A week later, the local police visited her again. They said Adrian's body had been found at the burned estate site, buried beneath debris that matched the cellar's foundation. DNA confirmed the match. Nora listened quietly. She didn't cry or celebrate. Closure felt hollow, like an ending she'd already lived through. She thanked the officer and went for a walk afterward, letting the cold air clear her thoughts. Whether he was alive or not no longer mattered. What mattered was that the fear no longer dictated how she lived. Death couldn't give her peace. Only choice could. That night, Nora dreamed of Greystone Hospital. The halls were empty, lights flickering faintly. She walked into Mrs. Vance's room and saw her younger self standing there beside the bed, holding a syringe. Across the room, Adrian watched from the doorway. Neither of them spoke. Nora moved closer to her younger self and took the syringe away. The monitors flatlined, but instead of panic, she felt stillness. When she woke, her cheeks were wet, but not from fear. The dream wasn't punishment. It was forgiveness. She had finally accepted her silence, not as guilt, but as something she could learn from. In the following weeks, Nora began volunteering to train new nurses about patient ethics and boundary management. She shared her story under a pseudonym, removing names but keeping the lessons intact. Her sessions were always full. She taught them how guilt could be used as control, and how compassion, when unguarded, could turn into chains. Every time she spoke, she felt a little lighter. The scars on her arm remained, but she stopped covering them. They weren't shame anymore. They were evidence of return. Her life was no longer a response to fear. It was a continuation of healing. One morning, while preparing a training session, she received an email with no subject line. Inside was a single attachment, a scanned obituary for a woman named Evelyn Ward. The photo showed Mrs. Vance's face. Nora stared at it confused. The obituary was dated 10 years before the real Mrs. Vance's death. That meant the woman she cared for wasn't Evelyn at all. It was an identity someone else had assumed. Adrian's mother had been using false names long before Nora ever met her. The family's pattern of deceit ran deeper than she ever imagined, decades older than her involvement. Nora printed the obituary and handed it to investigators. They confirmed it linked to older unsolved cases involving medical fraud and insurance scams. The revelation made headlines again. Reporters called the Vance legacy a web of manipulation spanning generations. Nora didn't read the articles. She already knew what they'd say, that evil often hides behind empathy. She refused to let the story become spectacle. For her it was a quiet truth. Monsters rarely look monstrous. They hold your hand, thank you for your kindness, and convince you that love means surrender. She vowed never to mistake the two again. One rainy afternoon, Nora received an invitation from a national nursing board. They wanted her to give a talk about psychological abuse in caregiving. She accepted reluctantly, knowing how public it would make her story. On the day of the speech, she stood before hundreds of nurses. Her voice shook only once, when she said that silence is not compassion, it's complicity disguised as care. The crowd stood in applause. Nora smiled, realizing that her voice, once buried by fear, had become her weapon. The past hadn't disappeared, but she'd finally stopped speaking from under its shadow. After the conference, Nora walked alone through the city. The lights reflected off wet pavement, and for the first time she didn't associate rain with danger. She stopped at a small bakery, bought a slice of cake, and sat by the window. Simple things felt new again. The taste of sugar, the quiet hum of people talking nearby. For years, she had been surviving. Now she was simply living. She thought of Adrian briefly, not with hatred, but with clarity. He had taken pieces of her life, but not the ability to rebuild it. That power was hers again. When Nora returned home, she found a letter waiting in her mailbox. The handwriting was unfamiliar, slanted and careful. Inside there was no message, only a pressed red flower between two pieces of paper. It wasn't Adrian's style, but it carried the same meaning, remembrance. She placed it in a drawer and left it there. She didn't panic, didn't call the police. She simply refused to react. The most powerful thing she could do now was nothing. Control had always thrived on response, and she wouldn't feed it anymore. Silence this time belonged to her. Her nights grew quieter. The bells she used to hear never returned. The shadows outside her window became just shadows again. She found joy in small rituals, watering plants, journaling, cooking simple meals. She even began mentoring younger nurses at her clinic. One day, a new trainee asked why she always tied her hair with a white ribbon. Nora smiled faintly and said it reminded her to stay untangled. The girl laughed, not knowing the weight of that answer. Nora didn't explain. Some stories, she realized, don't need retelling. They just need to end quietly. Months later, the news reported that the Vance estate had been demolished. The land would be turned into a public park. Photos showed the cleared foundation and a single surviving structure, the old bell tower. Seeing it brought a strange peace. The tower that once marked fear now stood as a symbol of renewal. Nora printed the article, folded it neatly, and placed it inside the jar that held the broken music box pieces. The past was no longer haunting her. It was archived. Memory, she had learned, wasn't a prison. It was proof of survival. She visited the new park on opening day. Families gathered, children played on the grass, and the air smelled of fresh soil. Near the edge of the property, a plaque read, "For those who gave care." Nora stood before it, tears in her eyes. She placed a small seashell from her new home beside the plaque, the one she'd once tied with a red thread. It was her final goodbye, not to him, but to the part of herself that once believed love meant endurance. She walked away, leaving the shell as both memory and release. Back home, Nora sat by her window as dusk settled. The jar on her shelf caught the fading light, glass, metal, and ash glowing softly. She thought about the years she'd spent inside fear's cage and how quietly freedom had arrived. It hadn't come through justice or revenge. It had come through patience, small choices, and the refusal to surrender her peace again. She didn't need closure from anyone else. She had written her own. When she finally went to bed, she slept without dreams, without bells, without ghosts waiting at the edge of consciousness, just rest. Weeks passed, and Nora began writing her experiences in a manuscript. She didn't call it a memoir. She called it a study on loyalty and guilt. The words flowed easily, not as confession but as education. Publishers showed interest. But she didn't rush. The book wasn't about fame. It was about warning others who might mistake control for affection. She ended it with one simple line: "Love doesn't demand silence." When she typed that final sentence, she closed the laptop gently, realizing that the story which began with obsession had ended in reclamation, not of safety but of self. Months later, her manuscript was published quietly under her real name. Reviews called it haunting and powerful, but Nora didn't care for praise. She cared for impact. Letters poured in from readers thanking her for giving words to experiences they'd never spoken aloud. For every message she read, she felt another weight lift from her chest. The book had done what she couldn't for years: turn pain into purpose. And though the world now knew her name, she finally felt invisible again, in the best way possible, no longer defined by the eyes that once watched her. One evening, while organizing her shelves, Nora found a small envelope tucked behind her books. It contained a photograph, her standing near the park plaque, smiling. On the back, in faint handwriting, were the words, "Freedom looks good on you." Her breath caught, but there was no fear left. Whether it was from someone she knew or from him didn't matter. She pinned it on her bulletin board as a reminder, not of threat, but of endurance. Some reminders, she decided, didn't have to be warnings. They could also be proof that she'd survived and kept living. As seasons changed, Nora grew older. Her hair streaked with gray. The nightmares faded completely. She continued teaching, mentoring, and speaking for victims of psychological control. Each year she lit a candle on the anniversary of Mrs. Vance's death, not for the woman herself, but for everyone who had loved wrongly. The candle wasn't a symbol of pain anymore, but of recognition. Healing wasn't forgetting. It was understanding. And Nora, who once hid from her past, now taught others how to face theirs without shame. Her silence had become strength, her scars, instruction. On a calm spring evening, Nora walked through the park where the Vance estate once stood. The bell tower still stood quietly against the sky. She sat on a bench beneath it, closing her eyes as the wind brushed through the grass. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed, chasing a red balloon. She smiled faintly at the sight. Red, once a color of control, now looked like freedom. For years she had lived inside someone else's story. Now, finally, she was the author again. The chapter that began with love and ended in fire had finally found its peaceful ending. That night, Nora returned home with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. She placed her bag by the door, poured herself tea, and sat near the window watching the city glow in soft yellow lights. For the first time, she didn't look over her shoulder. The silence in her apartment wasn't emptiness. It was peace. She looked at her reflection in the glass and saw someone older, steadier, and still standing. The woman who once flinched at shadows was gone. What remained was someone who had walked through fire and come out knowing her worth couldn't be stolen again. As she sipped her tea, Nora thought of all the faces she'd met. Patients, co-workers, victims, and survivors. They were her reminders that brokenness didn't mean defeat. She remembered Adrian too, not with hate but with a strange, distant pity. He had mistaken control for love, and in doing so destroyed everything he claimed to protect. Nora no longer needed revenge or closure. What she wanted was quiet continuation. Healing wasn't a dramatic moment, it was small, consistent acts of choosing life over memory, and she was finally doing that every single day. The following week, Nora was invited to speak at a memorial service for healthcare workers who had lost their lives. Standing before the crowd, she spoke about compassion and accountability. Her words carried calm strength, unshaken by the past. She said that care without boundaries isn't kindness. It's surrender. The audience stood in silence, deeply moved. When she stepped down from the podium, a young nurse hugged her and said, "You saved me." Nora smiled quietly. She hadn't saved anyone. She had simply told the truth. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. After the service, Nora walked home through the quiet evening streets. The air smelled of wet leaves and fresh rain, reminding her of the night everything began. But this time, the memory didn't carry weight. It felt distant, like a story she'd once read about someone else. She passed a small bookstore window and noticed her own book displayed in the corner. The cover read "Loyalty and Guilt" in plain letters. For a moment, she stood there, not out of pride but recognition that her pain had become something useful, something that no longer owned her. Inside her apartment, the jar on her shelf still glimmered faintly in lamplight. She opened it and took out one piece of the broken music box. The metal felt cool in her hand. She placed it inside a new box labeled "Things I Survived." Alongside it, she added the seashell, a printed photo of the park, and the letter from the nursing board. Each item was proof that her story had changed shape. No longer tragedy, but testament. She sealed the box, not to hide the past but to archive it properly as part of the life she reclaimed. Months passed, and Nora settled into calm routine. The nightmares never returned. Sometimes she still woke early, expecting a message or sound, but only the morning light greeted her. She'd sit by the window with tea, watching the sunrise paint the city gold. Peace, she learned, wasn't permanent. It was a choice renewed each day. And on the rare mornings when the old fear flickered, she didn't push it away. She simply acknowledged it, thanked it for reminding her how far she'd come, and let it drift away like smoke fading into clean air. One morning she received a letter from a former patient she'd once comforted during her Greystone days. The woman thanked her for being kind when no one else was. Enclosed was a photo of her new family and a small note. "Your kindness outlived the pain." Nora smiled as she read it. The message felt like closure delivered gently by the universe. A quiet assurance that her good deeds had mattered despite everything. She pinned the note above her desk as a daily reminder that no act of compassion, however small, was ever wasted. The years rolled forward peacefully. Nora grew older, her hair now silver. She still worked part-time, training young nurses. Her voice steady but soft. People admired her calm presence without knowing its price. She never shared the full story again, not because of shame, but because it no longer needed retelling. Her students often said she had a gift for making them feel safe. She'd smile, knowing safety was something she'd built brick by brick. After years of learning that control and comfort were never the same. It was a lesson she taught without words. One spring afternoon, Nora visited the park again. Flowers bloomed around the old bell tower, and children's laughter filled the air. She sat on the same bench she'd once cried on, and watched the sky shift from blue to gold. In her lap rested a new red thread, not from fear this time, but from a ribbon she'd cut herself. She tied it loosely around her wrist, not as a reminder of bondage, but of choice. Red no longer meant control, it meant survival. It meant she could look at what once hurt her, and see strength instead. As she sat quietly, an elderly man approached with his granddaughter. He asked to share the bench. They talked briefly about weather, flowers, and the laughter of children. When they stood to leave, the little girl handed Nora a daisy and said she looked like someone who kept secrets safe. The simplicity of the moment warmed her. For years, secrets had been weapons against her. Now they were harmless. Ordinary pieces of conversation shared between strangers on a peaceful afternoon. It was proof that life had finally returned to what it was always meant to be. That evening, Nora returned home to find a letter in her mailbox. It was postmarked years ago but had only just arrived. The envelope carried faint burn marks. Inside, a single page read, "If love becomes obedience, burn it." There was no signature, but the handwriting was familiar. Mrs. Vance's. Nora held the paper for a long time, unsure how it had survived. She placed it in her keepsake box beside the others. The message felt like a final echo of closure, not from Adrian or guilt, but from the woman whose death had begun everything. As night fell, Nora lit a candle on her windowsill. She thought of all the versions of herself, the nurse, the survivor, the teacher, the woman who finally understood that saving others didn't mean losing herself. She whispered a quiet thank you into the still air, not to anyone in particular but to time itself for carrying her forward. Outside, the city lights blinked like distant stars. She had spent years searching for peace, and now she realized it had been here all along, in small ordinary acts of choosing herself over fear. That night, she dreamed of the sea again. The waves were calm, the sky clear. She walked along the shore, barefoot, the sand warm beneath her feet. In the dream, she found the seashells she'd thrown years ago, still carrying the faint imprint of the red thread. She picked it up, held it to her ear, and heard nothing but wind. No voices, no bells, just life moving forward. When she woke, her pillow was wet with tears, not from sorrow, but from gratitude that even dreams could change once healing finally took hold. The following morning, Nora received an invitation to a reunion of Greystone Hospital staff. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure if she was ready to return. Then she realized the past no longer scared her. She went. The building had been renovated. Bright, open, full of light. The old ward where Mrs. Vance once stayed was now a children's unit. Seeing it filled Nora with unexpected joy. The same place where obsession had thrived was now filled with laughter. She walked through the halls slowly, touching the walls as if tracing over the scars of her own history. A young nurse recognized her and thanked her for her teachings. They talked briefly about empathy and balance, and when Nora left, she felt lighter than ever before. On her way out, she stopped near the garden behind the hospital. There, under the shade of a tree, she buried the last item from her keepsake box, the piece of the old music box. As she covered it with soil, she whispered goodbye. It wasn't a gesture of grief, but of completion. Every echo of that story had finally been returned to the earth where it belonged. Years drifted by peacefully. Nora retired from work and moved to a quiet coastal town. She spent her mornings walking by the water and her evenings writing letters to people she once mentored. Her life had become gentle, predictable, and beautifully ordinary. The trauma that once defined her had transformed into wisdom she carried lightly. Sometimes she still tied a red thread around her wrist, but only when she needed courage for something new, a symbol she had rewritten entirely. It no longer marked survival of pain but the continuation of a life freely chosen. One autumn evening, she met a widower named Samuel at a local cafe. They started talking casually, sharing stories about work and loss. Over time, their friendship grew into quiet companionship. He never asked about her past, and she never volunteered it. Their connection was built on presence, not history. For the first time in decades, love didn't feel heavy. It didn't demand silence or sacrifice. It simply existed, calm and kind. Nora realized that this was what love was supposed to be, not control, not redemption, but peace that asked for nothing in return. Nora and Samuel began spending their days gardening, cooking, and watching the tides. The simplicity felt almost sacred. One morning he noticed the faint scar on her wrist and asked what it was from. She smiled and said it was a reminder that she'd once untied something that nearly destroyed her. He nodded, understanding without needing details. They didn't talk about it again. In that quiet acceptance, Nora found something deeper than closure: trust. The kind that doesn't erase the past but coexists with it. Proof that some wounds don't need healing to stop hurting. Years later, as Nora's health began to fade, she spent more time by the window, watching the ocean's steady rhythm. She often thought about how far she'd come. From fear to freedom, from silence to voice. She didn't fear dying. She feared being forgotten, as someone broken. But deep down, she knew that wasn't her story anymore. Her book, her students, her words, they had already rewritten her legacy. She had turned pain into something enduring. When she closed her eyes, she felt calm, knowing that her life had ended exactly where it needed to, in peace. On her final night, she asked Samuel to open the window so she could hear the ocean. The air was cool, the scent of salt familiar. She whispered that life had been kind, even when it wasn't fair. She asked him to promise one thing: to keep the red thread, not as a memory of her, but as a reminder that freedom is never found through control. He nodded, tears in his eyes. Nora smiled faintly, her breathing slowing. The sound of waves filled the room, steady and soft, like a heartbeat fading into rest. After her passing, Samuel found her old keepsake box tucked away in the drawer. Inside was a note addressed to him. It read, "If you ever hear the sound of a bell in the wind, don't be afraid. It only means I'm reminding you to live." He folded the letter carefully and placed it beside her photograph on the shelf. Outside, the sea breeze brushed against the house, and a faint bell chime echoed in the distance. It wasn't haunting. It was gentle, like the memory of someone who had finally found peace. In the years that followed, the park named after the Vance estate became a place of reflection for survivors. A plaque near the old bell tower bore a quote from Nora's book: "Love that demands silence isn't love." Visitors left red threads tied around the fence as symbols of resilience. The city never knew her full story, but they carried her words like quiet truth. Nora's name became associated with compassion, not tragedy. The nurse who turned fear into wisdom and taught others that surviving was not just about endurance but about choosing life afterward. Samuel visited the park every year on her birthday. He'd sit near the bell tower and listen to the wind, sometimes hearing the faintest chime. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in memory, and memory, he realized, could be its own kind of immortality. He always brought a single white flower and tied it with a red thread before placing it under the plaque. The gesture wasn't mourning, it was gratitude. For Nora, for her courage, and for the quiet strength she left behind in everyone who learned her story. As time passed, Nora's story became something shared quietly between nurses, students, and survivors. Her book continued to circulate, her teachings still referenced in classes. No one remembered every detail, but her message remained intact: that love cannot exist where freedom is gone. The red thread she once feared had turned into a global symbol of resilience, tied around wrists, gates, and even hospital doors. Her pain had become purpose, her silence a voice that outlived her. She had given the world a story that refused to end in darkness. Years later, a child walking through the park found an old seashell buried near the plaque. Inside, it was a faded red thread, still intact. The child held it up to the sun, watching it glimmer. His mother told him it was a symbol of someone who chose kindness over fear. He smiled, tied it around his wrist, and ran ahead laughing. The waves from the nearby shore echoed softly through the wind, carrying no sorrow, only continuation. Nora's story had ended long ago, but its truth kept moving forward, alive in every act of gentle courage.